She was too fat to dance, too ugly to wed, but he removed the sack and proposed instead. Dodge Creek, Colorado, winter, 1882. Snow had not yet fallen, but the wind already bit like sharpened bone. It sliced through the alleys behind the blacksmith's shop, catching on shutters and frozen troughs. Behind that shop, under a crooked wooden sign reading, "Brides and Bonds, Noon," a dozen women stood shivering. Some stared like prisoners, others just wept. One among them stood different, not because she stood tall, but because she stood hidden. A burlap sack covered her face. Her coat barely reached her knees, and her hands, red and raw, trembled as they gripped each other. Ruth Avery did not look up. She did not shift. The sack scratched her cheeks with every gust of wind, but it was better this way. Let them laugh without knowing. Let them hate without seeing. She had not chosen this. Her parents, both taken by fever that spring, left her with a rusted stove, and a cousin who saw her as nothing more than $2 and a registry form. Too fat to dance, he muttered, too plain to wed. She once dreamed of dancing, in another life, in another body. Clear the way, boys, she's next. The voice came from Mr. Gaunt, the general store owner turned auctioneer. He gestured with the tip of his cane toward Ruth. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd of miners and drifters by the fire barrel. "She ain't much to look at," he called. "Big as a barn, face like a mule, so we bagged it. Startin' at $2. Any takers?" More laughter. One man whistled. Another spat. Still, Ruth didn't move. She imagined shrinking. Her knees buckled, her throat burned. She heard her mother's voice, long buried. "You've got music in you, Ruthie. No weight in the world can stop a heart like yours." Then silence cut through the cruelty. Boots stepped forward, not hurried, just steady. $2, said a low, calm voice. Male, measured. A few heads turned. Ruth could not see him, but she felt something shift in the cold air. It wasn't pity. It wasn't disgust. It was quiet. Gaunt blinked. "You serious?" "I said 2, the voice replied. "You want more." Then came the clink of 2 silver coins on the crate. "Well," Gaunt muttered, "cheapest wife in the West. She's yours. Take her before she freezes." This time, no one laughed. The man stepped close. Ruth felt his presence near, but no hand grabbed her, no voice barked orders. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded under the sack. "Then come on, storm's coming." That was all. He didn't lift the sack. He didn't tug her arm. He just turned and walked, slow and sure. And she followed. She had no name for him. No understanding of why he stepped in. Only his footsteps and the bitter wind between them, and something she hadn't felt in months. Dignity. They passed the stables and the saloon. The same places where boys once called her pig face. No one said anything now. The sack stayed on, but the crowd parted without smirks. At the edge of town, the snow began to fall, dry flakes, stinging skin. The man helped her onto a tall roan horse without asking her weight. His hands were work-worn, his saddle weathered. Then he mounted behind her and finally spoke. "My name's Thorne Callan," he said. "I own a ranch west of the ridge. It's quiet. You'll have your own room. You can talk or not. I don't need a servant. I just didn't want to leave you behind." Her throat tightened. So many words had been swallowed across the years that her voice barely remembered how to speak. But one did. "Thank you." They rode into the rising wind, 2 shadows on horseback. A man who had lost love, a woman who had never known it, and behind them, Dodge Creek vanished in the cold. The sack stayed on for now. But something beneath it had already begun to thaw. The wind worsened as they rode west, silence heavy between them, broken only by the creak of leather and the roan horse's steady snorts. Ruth sat stiff in the saddle, hands clutched to the horn, the burlap sack brushing her lips with every breath. She waited for it. The questions, the ridicule, the command to speak, the moment he would demand what he'd paid for. But none came. They stopped once beside a frozen creek. Thorn handed her a blanket from his saddlebag. She took it, slow and unsure. He did not touch her. As dusk turned the sky to violet, a cabin appeared between two hills, its sloped roof patched, chimney smoking, and a crooked fence guarding it from the cold. "You can tie the horse there," Thorn said, dismounting. Ruth hesitated. Then his hand found the reins, not rough, just steady, and he helped her down with one motion before stepping back. Inside it smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and stew. Ruth hovered near the door, sack still on, unsure where to go or if she was even welcome. Thorn ladled stew into a tin bowl and placed it on the table. Then he gestured toward a hallway. "There's a room back there," he said. "The bed's clean. No one's used it since my brother passed through." Ruth didn't move. He sat down at the table and picked up his own bowl. "Eat if you want, or just have the bread. You don't need to talk." Still no sharpness in his voice. Just quiet matter-of-factness. She took the bowl and sat opposite him, fumbling with the spoon through the sack. He didn't look at her. Only asked, "Do you know how to ride?" She paused, then nodded once. "Good. Snow'll trap us by February. If we need to get out, you'll have to manage." That was it. He finished his food, nodded toward the hallway, and disappeared into his room, door closing gently behind him. Ruth didn't sleep. She lay on the bed, sack still on, waiting for footsteps that never came. At dawn, the scent of coffee drifted in, followed by the rhythmic crack of wood splitting outside. A day passed, then 2, then 5. He spoke little, she less, but a rhythm formed. He left early. She swept the hearth. He brought wood. She stirred broth. They ate in silence. She wore the sack through it all. Until the 7th morning. She stood in the kitchen, peeling turnips with frozen fingers. One slipped. The knife nicked her thumb. She hissed, sucking the wound as the turnip rolled across the floor. Frustration surged. Tears came before she could stop them. Bent over the table, she tried to cry silently, chest heaving inside the sack. Then came soft boot steps. She froze. "Ruth." His voice, gentle. She didn't answer. She heard a bowl placed beside her. Then cloth shifting. "Let me," Thorn said. She turned slightly, confused. His fingers reached for the knot at the back of her head, not forceful, just slow and deliberate. She flinched, then stilled. The sack loosened. And fell. She didn't look up, but he did. He said nothing for a moment. She waited for the recoil, the polite falsehood, the pause before disgust. Instead, he exhaled and said, "I once loved a beautiful woman. She turned every head in town. A beat passed, but I've never seen anyone stand in silence while a whole town tried to bury them and not flinch." Ruth's eyes filled again, unsure whether from the pain of memory or the weight of being seen. Thorn stepped back. "You don't have to wear that in this house." Then he left her standing there, in the quietest morning she'd ever known. The days that followed were quiet but full. Ruth rose before dawn most mornings, stoking the fire, boiling water, scrubbing the pine counters until her arms ached. At first, she moved like a ghost, never assuming, never asking. But by the 2nd week, the rhythm of the ranch had settled into her bones. She swept, cooked, mended a saddlebag, and learned to split kindling. The first time the axe bounced, she nearly cried. By the 4th try, the log cracked in 2. Thorn, watching from the porch, nodded once and said nothing. Later, she found a pair of leather gloves on the table. Handmade, lined with wool, sized larger than most. They fit perfectly. She stared at them for a long while. One afternoon, while mucking the stables, she discovered a filly with a twisted leg. She crouched beside it for nearly an hour, whispering, massaging the joint. When Thorn found her there, skirts dusty and hands red, he only said, "She's taken to you." Then, quietly, he handed her a small book. The edges were worn, the cover faded blue. "This belonged to Hélène," he said, "my wife." Ruth froze. You don't have to read it, he added. But if you ever wonder what this house was like before, I'm not asking you to fill a shadow. That night, Ruth read the journal. Inside were soft entries, recipes, garden notes, quiet thoughts of loneliness when Thorn stayed out too long with the horses. She closed it after an hour, eyes wet, not from envy, but from understanding. A few days later, she noticed a new chair in the kitchen, cedar, sturdy, with a wide seat and curved back. Her old stool had groaned beneath her. This one didn't make a sound. She ran her fingers along the edge and found initials burned faintly underneath. R.A. He had made it. Said nothing, but she knew. One night, a storm rolled in fast and fierce. Thunder echoed, sleet rattled the windows. Thorn had gone to check traps that afternoon and hadn't returned by dusk. Ruth paced until her legs ached. When he finally came back, soaked and shivering, she didn't ask questions. She took his coat, handed him a towel, and poured hot water over ginger and honey into a chipped blue mug. He sat by the fire, steam curling off him. She passed him the cup. He took it, their fingers brushing. He didn't pull away. He touched her wrist, gently. Then nodded. His eyes, usually distant, held something new. Thank you. That week, something shifted. Their silences warmed. Thorn began leaving firewood by her door. She began humming at the stove. One morning, he asked how she kept bread soft in the mountain cold. My mother, she replied. She taught you well, he said. The words stayed with her all day. After dinner one evening, Ruth stepped into the stables. The moon hung high. Rain began to fall in thin sheets. The scent of hay and leather filled the air. Horses slept. She stood barefoot on the packed floor. And then she danced. Not like a ballerina, like someone who remembered what music once felt like. Her arms moved, slow and hesitant. Her feet slid across straw and dirt. No rhythm, no audience. Just motion. A voice behind her said, I never learned to dance. She froze. Thorn stood at the door, coat damp, eyes soft. I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean. I'm terrible at it, he said, stepping forward. But if you're willing, maybe you could teach me? He held out his hand. Ruth stared, then placed hers in his. At first, they stumbled. His boots bumped hers, her steps faltered. But they kept moving. Under the stable's leaking roof, with horses breathing beside them and rain tapping softly, they danced. No music but memory. No spotlight but the moon. And in Thorn's gaze, calm, unwavering, free of pity, Ruth saw what she'd longed for her entire life. Someone who did not look away. The town looked different now, though Ruth suspected it was not the buildings that had changed, but her. She sat beside Thorn in the wagon, fingers curled tightly in her lap, head low beneath the edge of her bonnet. The sky hung heavy with spring thaw, and patches of brown slush lined the muddy road into Dodge Creek. It had been over a month since she'd last seen it, since she'd been bought in front of it. Now, she was returning. Thorn was silent beside her, one hand holding the reins, the other resting casually on his thigh. He didn't seem nervous, he never did. But Ruth felt every heartbeat like a drum in her ears. Every bounce of the wagon reminded her of the burlap sack, the jeering, the bargain her life had become. They stopped outside the general store. He jumped down first, then turned and held out his hand. Ruth hesitated. She had no sack now, no shield. Just her face, her body, her name. All things the town had once laughed at. A door creaked open across the street. A woman leaned against a porch post, elbow nudging another. The whispers began like wind through dry corn stalks. That her? Lord, it is. The burlap sack girl, now the mistress of a horse ranch? Ruth froze, her breath caught, chest tightening. She stepped back, half-turned toward the wagon, her instinct to flee so strong it almost moved her feet. Thorn caught it. He said nothing at first. Just bent down and knelt. In the middle of the muddy street, In front of half the town, Thorn Callan went to one knee before her. Then he pulled a worn handkerchief from his coat pocket and reached for her foot. The hem of her dress was stained with slush. One boot bore a splatter of thick, ugly mud. With slow, deliberate care, he wiped the mud away. He did not look at the gawkers. He did not hurry. When he stood again, he turned to face the townsfolk. His voice, though calm, carried like a shot across still water. "She is not a discounted item," he said. "She is not a joke or a debt or a pity." He paused. "She is the reason I am still standing here and not buried beside my wife." The street went silent. Not stunned into awkwardness, but something deeper, something reverent. No one laughed. A few lowered their eyes. A man at the water pump cleared his throat awkwardly. Even Mrs. Gilbreth, who'd once said Ruth had the posture of a plow horse, stepped back into the shadows of her porch without another word. Ruth's throat ached. She did not know whether to cry or run or kiss the man in front of everyone. Instead, she reached for his hand. Thorn didn't say anything else. He simply helped her down, tucked her hand under his arm, and together they walked into the store, past shelves of flour, beans, and judgment that had lost its sharpness. As they moved through the narrow aisles, Ruth could still feel eyes on her, but not with the same weight. There was hesitation now, respect, maybe even shame. Outside, an old man leaned on his cane, watching from the bench beside the barber shop. He scratched his chin and muttered just loud enough for the nearest bystander to hear. "Well, I'll be damned. Who said Thorn Callan didn't have a heart?" No one answered. No one needed to. Because in that moment, the story of the burlap sack girl had changed, and Ruth Avery knew it. The days had grown warmer, but Ruth's body hadn't kept pace. She awoke with a tightness in her chest and a lingering ache in her limbs, but she pushed through it. There were stalls to clean, kindling to split, water to draw. The hens needed feeding, the floors sweeping, the sourdough tended. Every hour of the day filled itself with motion. She told herself she was simply tired. But the truth was, something deeper had taken root inside her, a need to prove she was worth the space she took, that she wasn't just the woman bought for $2, that she could earn her place with sweat and silence. By the end of the week, she was running on fumes. She did not notice how often she paused to breathe, how her hands trembled when she stirred the stew, how her vision blurred slightly when she bent to lift a pail. Until one evening, after sunset, everything stopped. Thorn had ridden out early to check the west fence. The sky had turned gold and then gray. Ruth had managed to drag a sack of feed from the barn, but halfway across the yard, her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed hard, knees hitting frozen dirt, the world spinning. When Thorn returned, he found her crumpled near the chicken coop, one hand still clutching the edge of the sack, her forehead damp with sweat, skin pale as ash. He dropped the reins and was beside her in an instant. "Ruth!" His voice cracked, sharp, terrified. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, but she didn't respond. He lifted her, arms trembling from urgency rather than weight, and carried her inside. He stoked the fire higher, threw off his coat, and knelt beside the bed, wiping her brow with a cloth soaked in cold well water. He brewed ginger root and honey, coaxed drops into her mouth, whispering her name between every breath. She moaned once, delirious, then said in a cracked voice not meant for him, "Mama!" Thorn froze. Her lips moved again, barely audible. "Just once, please, someone see me." The words ripped through him. He held her hand through the night. Clumsy fingers smoothing sweat from her hair, gentle palms against her back to ease her shivering. He never once left her side, not for sleep, not even to eat. When morning came, Ruth stirred. Her eyes blinked slowly against the light streaming through the cabin window. Her throat felt raw, her body weak, but the fever had broken. She shifted slightly, and something thumped lightly against the blanket. At her side sat a wooden box, small, hand-carved, polished at the edges. Her name was burned into the lid, in careful script. She sat up slowly and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in clean cloth, was a pair of slippers, soft leather, goat hide, supple, and shaped with care. The stitching was imperfect but deliberate, the form curved not like a store-bought shoe, but as if made for her feet alone. Her breath caught in her throat. She touched the heel, then the toe, and realized something that made her eyes burn. He had measured her. Somehow, without waking her, he had memorized the shape of her toes, the width of her foot, the arch of her step. And then she saw it. A folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the lining. She opened it with shaking hands. The handwriting was unsteady but unmistakably his. "They said you should never dance. I think they've never seen the wind move through the mountains." Her hand flew to her mouth. Not because of the gift, not even the note, but because in that moment, after sickness, after silence, after everything, she finally knew. He had seen her. Not just her labor, not her shape, not her service, but her. The girl who used to dance alone in her bedroom. The woman who thought the world would always look away. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she held the shoes to her chest. Outside, the birds had begun to sing. And inside her, something long buried stretched toward the light. It was the last thing Ruth expected. The sound of a wagon pulling into the yard, wheels creaking, boots clattering on the front steps. She was kneading bread when the knock came, sharp, impatient. Thorne had ridden into town early that morning. She wiped her hands and opened the door, expecting a neighbor or delivery. Instead, a woman she had never seen stood there. Elegant, tall, her dress finely stitched, travel-worn but expensive, auburn hair twisted into a perfect coil, gloves that had never touched mud. "Is Thorne Callan here?" the woman asked, stepping inside without invitation. Ruth blinked. "He's out. May I help you?" The woman's eyes scanned the room with cold precision. "I am Eliza Maynard, Ellen's sister." Ruth's breath froze. The sister of his late wife. "I've come to settle some family matters," Eliza continued, glancing at the hearth and the wooden chair Ruth used, "and to collect what remains of my sister's estate." Ruth steadied her voice. "I believe the estate belongs to Thorne." A thin smile. "And yet he seems to have replaced her, with a girl who cooks stew and wears gloves too large for her hands." Ruth said nothing. Eliza moved to the mantel, fingering a carved wooden box Thorne had made. She sighed. "My sister had grace. She read poetry before breakfast. And you?" Her eyes narrowed. "You were purchased for $2 and led here in a sack." A sharp catch in Ruth's throat. "You cannot possibly think you belong in this house," Eliza said. "A woman who was sold like livestock cannot stand where a Callan once stood." Still, Ruth said nothing. Her silence was not weakness, it was steel. She stepped outside into the cold. The insult hung in the air like driftwood in the wind. She refused to be weighed like a piece of property. Moments later, Thorne returned. He found Ruth on the porch, shawl wrapped tightly, hands clenched. Their eyes met, briefly. He saw enough to know something had gone wrong. He entered the room. Eliza stood squarely in the center, storm-faced. "You brought her into your home," she said before he could speak. "Into Ellen's place." "She lives here," he replied simply. Eliza scoffed. "So it's true. You replaced my sister with someone the town wouldn't even take as charity." Thorne's jaw tightened, his voice dropped. "Don't. She is an embarrassment to your name." "Eliza." "She was bought, Thorne." "Yes," he said quietly. "She was." He took a step forward, each word sharp with restraint. "But what you don't understand is, Ruth did not replace Ellen. No one could." Eliza crossed her arms. "She didn't walk in here and take something from you." He glanced toward the door where Ruth had stood. "She gave it back to me." He let his words hang. "I was a dead man walking, breathing, eating, speaking, but buried. Ruth didn't just walk in, she pulled me out." Eliza's eyes flickered. She did not interrupt. "If you cannot see that," he finished, "then maybe you never understood your sister at all." Silence followed, heavy, full of truth. Eliza turned, collected her gloves off the chair, and walked to the door. Her steps echoed across the floor. At the threshold she paused, looked back, maybe to speak, confess, but she left without a word. As her wagon rolled away, disappearing into trees, Thorne stepped outside. Ruth sat beneath the porch awning, the wind stirring her shawl. He did not sit beside her. He knelt. Startled, she watched him reach for her hand, not to pull her up, but simply to hold it. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," he said quietly. "I know," Ruth whispered. "I meant what I said in there." Her lips trembled. "You pulled me out, Ruth, not into someone else's place, into mine." She closed her eyes against the sting of his words. And for the first time since Eliza came, she allowed herself to believe it was not pity. It was choice. The morning sun never rose in Ruth's eyes that day. She awoke before the roosters, her heart pounding as though already running from something. Quietly, she packed. A shawl, the soft gloves he made, the leather slippers he'd crafted, and the letter. She placed the folded sheet on the nightstand beside his pocket knife and the old photograph of his wife, then closed the door and walked through wet grass, never glancing back at the cabin. By the time the rain began, first gentle drops, then a steady drum on wood, Ruth had already gone miles away. Her dress felt heavy with goodbye, her boots squelching through mud she barely noticed. Inside, Thorne woke to a still house, the bed cold, the stove dying, echoes where laughter used to live. He found the note, her handwriting soft and slanted. "I know I am a scar in the story of your life, Thorne, a reminder stitched over a wound. I thank you for seeing me. But I do not wish to be a burden you carry out of kindness. Please live free. I will be all right." His hands shook. The wind rose outside and thunder rumbled as he pulled on his coat, saddled the roan, and rode into the storm with a heart louder than his horse's hooves. He knew where she'd gone. She had once spoken of a chapel on a hillside, the place where no one could see my face when I prayed. Only my voice mattered. As lightning slashed the sky, the derelict door stood ajar. He dismounted, boots sinking into mud, the hinges groaning like a sigh. Inside, the air was cold, and there she sat, curled near a broken pew, knees to chest, cloak drawn tight. She didn't look up until he said softly, "I brought something." She turned. He held the burlap sack she had worn the day they met, folded neatly, treated reverently. "I kept it," he said, "not to remember that day, but to refuse forgetting what the world did to you." He stepped closer. "And I never want to see this on you again." He let the sack drop to the floor. Then he knelt. In his hand was a worn band of braided leather with a single green stone. "I first saw you with a sack on your head. That's the ugliest truth I carry." His voice faltered. "The world made you believe you were unworthy of light, that you needed to hide. But I've seen your strength, your kindness, your fire." He met her eyes. "I've seen you, Ruth." He drew a breath. "So I ask, no sack, no crowd, no fear, will you marry me?" The storm outside hushed, like someone finally listening. Ruth stared, not with pity, but with recognition. Slowly she rose, walked forward, and knelt. Her hands closed around his. For the first time, she didn't look down. "I thought I had to be small to be chosen," she whispered. "But you never asked me to shrink." He smiled, forehead touching hers. "I would never fit you into a box, Ruth Avery. You were born to break them." She laughed, soft, shaking, and nodded, "Yes." Outside, the storm passed. Inside, two people knelt, not to pray, but to begin. The chapel looked different by daylight. The broken beams were still there, the faded altar unchanged. But someone had swept the floor. Wildflowers, freshly picked, lined the windows. A lantern flickered from a low beam, casting warm, dancing shadows across the old wood. It wasn't grand. It was sacred. Ruth stood at the edge of the aisle in a simple white dress. The fabric was coarse, homespun, stitched by hand, but every seam held care. At her feet were the goat leather slippers Thorn had made, now polished to a soft sheen. He stood waiting, suit brushed clean, hair damp from a hurried wash in the creek. Beside him were 3 witnesses: a wrinkled cowhand with mud on his boots, a widow from down the valley who brought a cake wrapped in a quilt, and a young preacher with more hope than years. No orchestra played. No bells rang. But when Ruth walked toward him, eyes steady, the hush between each step was music enough. The vows were brief, but the silence after held more than words could carry. And when Thorn kissed her, it was not as a man claiming a prize, but as a man thanking the sky for its mercy. That night, they danced. Just the 2 of them beneath a flickering lantern, on the chapel's old floor. No music, only the rhythm of their feet, the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of breath and belonging. He led clumsily. She smiled anyway. The wind outside stirred gently, as if even the earth knew to move slow for them. In the months that followed, Ruth didn't return to the shadows. She opened a small studio in the back room of the town's chapel, where light came through cracked windows and laughter echoed off worn walls. She taught dance to girls who had been told no. Girls with crooked spines and thick ankles. Girls who stuttered, limped, hid. And she told them, "You don't need permission to dance. You just need someone to believe you're worth being seen." The town changed. Slowly. People who once whispered now waved. Men who once mocked lowered their hats. Women who once crossed streets now stopped to ask her about classes. She never wore the sack again. But she didn't throw it away either. She kept it hanging in the corner of the studio, clean, folded, and untouched, a reminder, a relic. One afternoon, a girl with sharp bones and a quiet voice lingered after class. She looked up, eyes curious, and asked, "Miss Ruth, did anyone ever call you ugly?" Ruth smiled softly, walked to the corner. She touched the burlap gently, like an old bruise no longer tender. "They did," she said. "They said no one would ever want me, that I was too much, or not enough." The girl looked stunned. "What happened?" Ruth's eyes glowed. "Someone saw me," she whispered, "really saw me, and didn't look away." She turned back to the girl, kneeling to meet her eyes. And that's how a woman once hidden beneath a sack found a love so true it didn't ask the world for permission. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. Inside, Ruth Avery Callan stood tall, barefoot on old wood, surrounded by light. And every gaze that met hers bowed just a little. Thank you for joining us on Ruth Avery's journey, a tale of quiet courage and love that asks for no permission. If her story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. For more Wild West tales of fierce hearts, gentle hands, and love that never quits, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and turn on notifications. Because here, love doesn't just whisper, it rides, it fights, and it remembers. We'll see you in the next story.